All right, it's time for another 2023 college football team season preview and game-by-game prediction. And boy, do we have a good one for you today. The Florida Gators. Oh, yeah, good morning, that's Uncle Lou here. Yeah, that's right, it's me, Uncle Lou, live on LouTube for you. Thanks for watching. I really appreciate it also. In addition to that as well, subscribe to this channel if you're not already. I post college football videos almost every single day of the year. We do live shows several times a week. We have call-in shows every Tuesday and Thursday night. Make sure you're subscribing to the channel. Become a part of the community. I know you hate me. That's fine. This is just a pretty average, just slightly below average YouTube channel, to be honest with you. But the comment section in the community that we've created around this channel is second to none. All right, I do a whole series of these videos in the offseason, team previews and game-by-game predictions. You know, a lot of people do prediction videos and they say, well, such and such team's going 9-3 or this team's going 7-5. I do that, but I try to pick out the losses too. So when we get ready to go through Florida's schedule here on the second half of this video, I'm going to put their schedule up on the screen. We're going to go through it game by game, and I'm going to give you a winner and a loser for every single game on the schedule. Prior to that, we're going to break down the Florida Gators roster, talk about who they lost from last year, who's coming back, coaching situation. They've got a new defensive coordinator, transfers, recruiting classes, all that kind of stuff. Then we'll get into the schedule. Shout out to my boy Celine Driver over on the Uncle Lou Patreon page. He's a Florida man, Lou. He suggested that I do this Florida team season preview and prediction. Every day when I sit down to do these prediction videos, I head over to the Patreon page, I scroll through the list, I pick out a team, and that's the team that I do. So the questions that I get all the time, like which team are you doing next, or when are you doing this team, or whatever, I don't really know the exact schedule. I just sit down and literally scroll through the Patreon page and pick one out. So Celine Driver, this video is for you, buddy. If you're a member on my Patreon page, make sure you head over there, find that post. It's the first post on the page. When you go over there, leave a comment, let me know what team it is you want to see me do. I'm going to do these prediction videos up until really about the point the season starts, a couple of weeks, halfway through August or so. So we got a couple of weeks left in June, and then July, and then a couple of weeks in August. So make sure you're getting over there. The list is already really long. I'm going to do my best to get through every single team that's on that Patreon page. If you're not a member on the Uncle Lou Patreon page and you want to be, there's a link in the description of this video. Click that link. It'll take you over there. You can have yourself a look around, and if you decide to join the channel, I would really appreciate it. All right, the Florida Gators, an absolute failure last year. And honestly, the year before, too, which we'll talk about in a minute, back-to-back losing seasons for the first time in a while for the Florida Gators. But only one of those seasons belongs to Billy Napier, of course. First-year head coach, Billy Napier, Sunbelt Billy, Cajun Willie Taggart, whatever you want to call him. Florida brings him in from Louisiana. Not Louisiana, Louisiana Lafayette, I guess it was, which is really just Louisiana now. Anyway, they've sort of changed their name. Point is, they bring him in from the group of five. He becomes Florida Gators' new head coach following Dan Mullen, who was fired after, was it 3 seasons? 19, 20, and 21, is that right? Anyway, Dan Mullen was out. Billy Napier came in. And last year was just a complete failure. I mean, there's no sugarcoating it. And I know people say, well, it's his first year. I get it. Look, I get all that. And that some of that is true. And just because he failed his first year doesn't mean he'll fail every year. We all know that. More thoughts on Billy Napier maybe in a second. But so last year, first year, 6-6 in the regular season, lose their bowl game to finish with a losing record, giving Florida back-to-back losing seasons for the first time since the 70s, I believe. They have not had 3 losing seasons in a row since the 50s, and they've got a pretty good chance of accomplishing that this year, a losing record, which, of course, we'll talk about in the second half of the video. What did they do last year? Well, they started things off good, a win over Utah, which turned out to be their best win of the year. Now, we didn't really know that at the time. It was in week 1, and I was actually talking about this the other day on the call-in show. I think it would have been better for Florida's reputation and Billy Napier's reputation if this Utah game would have happened more towards the end of the year. Because it's hard to even remember that Florida beat Utah because it was just all downhill after that. There just was no real bright spots for the rest of the season for Florida. They followed that win up against Utah with a week 2 loss at home to Kentucky, 26-16. They nearly lost the following week, survived really, against a terrible South Florida team at home, 31-28. Then the loss on the road at Tennessee. Only Florida's second loss to Tennessee, I believe, in like the last 16 or 17 seasons. Come back home, beat Eastern Washington, and you beat Mizzou. And that was probably your second best win outside of the Utah win, maybe South Carolina. But And then yet another loss to LSU, a team that's just had your number over the last decade or so. I think LSU is something like 8-2 against Florida in the last 10 years. Yeah, you bye week, you're blown out by your rival Georgia. You get a win on the road at Texas A&M, which in normal years, considering how bad Florida was last year, that would have probably been considered a good win. But if there was a team in the SEC that was more disappointing than Florida last year, it was Texas A&M. Now, to your credit, you beat them. Had you lost that game, wow, would have been really bad. But you beat them, and it wasn't even really close. South Carolina, this is actually probably your best win, 38-6 against South Carolina. Now, I don't think a whole lot of people were necessarily impressed with that win at the time. It was a home win for Florida. But given what happened the next 2 weeks, that win looked pretty good. South Carolina gets blown out by Florida on the road in Gainesville. They then come back home and beat a top 10 Tennessee team, then go on the road and beat a top 10 Clemson team to close out the season. So that made that South Carolina win look pretty good. Then you got absolutely humiliated, destroyed, and basically laughed off the internet for 3 or 4 months by Oregon State, a Pac-12 team. They beat you 30-3. And you're going to say, oh, it's a bowl game, players quit. Yeah, but same thing everywhere. Oregon State, too. Jack Legg was the quarterback. Jack Miller was the quarterback in that game for Florida. Absolutely horrible. Looked like he'd never seen a football before. Florida has addressed that situation. We'll talk about that when we get to the roster. But that's a rundown of Florida's first season under Billy Napier. Not good. 6-6 in the regular season, finishing up at 6-7 after a loss in the Las Vegas Bowl to a middle-of-the-road Pac-12 team. Just absolutely humiliating. All right, let's look at some numbers for Florida heading into next year before we talk about their roster and their coaching staff. I do a ranking every offseason. In fact, I do 3 rankings during the offseason. I do one after the signing day in February. I then update that ranking after the spring games wrap up at the end of April, beginning of May. That's my most current ranking. And then I do a third and final offseason ranking, usually about 3 or 4 weeks before the season starts, first week of August, probably. Where do I have Florida ranked heading into the 2023 season? I do a top 25, unranked. I don't have Florida in the top 25 right now in my preseason or offseason rankings. Now, everybody does their rankings different, and I get it. My rankings are not a projection necessarily of where I think a team will finish. My rankings are a projection of where I think a team is or deserves to be ranked at that particular moment in time. Florida spring game was an absolute disaster. It was horrible. There's really nothing good to glean from Florida spring game. Their quarterback situation is a total mess. It just is. So I've got them unranked. If I did a ranking of all the Power 5 teams or all 133 or however many we have now, Power 5 and Group of 5 Division I teams, I would probably have Florida slotted somewhere in the 45 to 50 range right now. Again, it's not a projection of where I think Florida will end up at the end of the year. That doesn't necessarily mean I think at the end of the year Florida will be the 50th best team. But if I had them ranked right now, it would probably be somewhere in that range. National rankings, and you can find these literally anywhere. Every major sports site, sports blog, podcaster, YouTuber, TikToker, you name it, puts out dozens of off-season or preseason top 25s. I looked over about 10 of them, everywhere from household names like ESPN, Sports Illustrated, Fox Sports, 24/7, Saturday Down South. I looked all over the place. You're not going to find Florida ranked in any preseason top 25 rankings. So they're just not there. So they're unranked everywhere you look. What does Vegas think about Florida's win total for 2023? A win total is a betting number. Keep that in mind. So Vegas puts out a win total for every single team. And the way you bet on that number is if you think that team is going to win more than that number of games, you bet the over. If you think that team's going to win less, you bet the under. So a win total, it doesn't mean that a team is going to win that number of games, but it is a good indication of how the betting public feels about a particular team. The win total, or the projected win total for Florida, according to Vegas, 5.5. A lot of people are going to roll their eyes at that. That's fine. You can bet the over. You think Florida's winning 6 games, or you think they're winning 10 games. You bet the over 5.5. If you think they're winning less than 5.5, you think they're going 5-7, 4-8, 3-9, you bet the under. That's just an indication of where the betting public is on Florida. That number moves up and down based on how people bet. So if a bunch of people start betting over 5.5, that number will go up at some point to 6, and then 6.5, and then 7. And if a bunch of people start betting the under, it'll start going back down. So like I said, it's just an indication of what the betting public feels about Florida. The over-under is 5.5 on the wins for Florida. Any Heisman Trophy candidates for Florida in 2023? The short answer is no. Now, when you go look these things up, again, Vegas betting sites, they'll have 100 names on there, right? And you can, different odds assigned to different players. Graham Mertz is on that list. His odds are plus 20,000. Astronomical for Heisman Trophy odds. Just to give you an idea of how far down the list you have to go to find Graham Mertz for Heisman odds at plus 20,000. He's on there with people named Armani Goodwin and Carson Steele. And if you're saying to yourself, I've never heard of those two people, don't worry, neither has anyone else. And that's the point. Graham Mertz is not winning the Heisman. But if you are allergic to money and you want to bet on it, the odds are plus 20,000. What about a national title? The odds are also plus 20,000 on Florida winning the national title, which, again, is astronomical and way down the list. Here are some other teams that are currently sitting with plus 20,000 odds to win the Natty, so basically the same chance as Florida. Nebraska, Arkansas, Pittsburgh, and Mississippi State. So according to Vegas, Florida's got just as good a shot of winning a national title this year as those 4 teams do, which is basically no shot at all. The SEC title. Could Florida win the SEC title in 2023? Again, the short answer in my mind, no, they don't have a chance of winning the SEC title. But again, if you're allergic to money and you want to throw some money away, the odds are plus 10,000. That puts them at 10th in the SEC. So only 4 teams in the SEC have worse odds to win the SEC than Florida. So there you go. That's just kind of a look at some of the numbers there. Let's get into the coaching staff, the roster, the players, and what Florida might look like in 2023. Billy Napier, of course, is back for his second year in from Louisiana, like we already talked about. 6-6 last year, 6-7, 6-7 after the bowl loss. New defensive coordinator. Now, this is a bright spot for Florida, at least I think. If there's a knock against this defensive coordinator, it would be that he's young. And I guess we'll talk more about him in a minute. Was it Austin Armstrong, I believe is his name. He comes from Alabama. I think he's got some potential to be a really good college coach. Now, like I said, really young, 29 years old, but a shakeup defensively for Florida after they had one of the worst defenses in the SEC last season. In fact, there are several categories, defensive categories, where they were dead last when it came to defense last season. So, and they replaced a lot of coaches, but primary among them was the defensive coordinator. They actually lost a lot of coaches to the NFL, which on one hand could be seen as a compliment, like, wow, the NFL really likes the coaching staff you've put together. But on the other hand, and it is a compliment, but on the other hand, it's just never good to turn over that much coaching staff in 1 year, generally speaking. So we'll see how that translates to 2023 with basically half the coaching staff being brand new. Let's take a look at the offense, then we'll do the defense. Of course, Anthony Richardson gone at quarterback, and it's a weird kind of. It's hard to talk about Anthony Richardson, really, because clearly he was terrible in college. I mean, we all watched him play, and he was just absolutely horrible. I mean, he had a hard time. He appeared to have a hard time anyway reading defenses. It was like week 9 or 10. He had more interceptions than touchdowns at that point in the year. Now, he's clearly very athletic and mobile and did a lot of running around and extended a lot of plays and stuff like that. But just purely from a college football playing quarterback perspective, he was not very good. The NFL looked at that and went, we don't care. We're drafting him number 4 overall. Now, you can look at it a couple of different ways, but you can't ignore the obvious, which is that Florida had Anthony Richardson for 3 years with 2 different coaching staffs, and neither one of those coaching staffs were able to get anything at all out of Anthony Richardson, which the NFL says is a top 5 NFL pick. Now, to me, that doesn't shine a positive light on either Dan Mullen or Billy Napier or those offensive staffs that were there. You've got a guy that the NFL says is a probable starter. I mean, you spend a top 5 pick on a quarterback, that means you plan on him starting for a long time for you. And he's got a lot of physical gifts, there's no doubt about it. But for whatever reason at Florida, Anthony Richardson was terrible. He's gone. In comes Graham Mertz. Graham Mertz is not any good. He's not. This is another guy that we've all watched play college football for multiple years, And not one time has anybody watched Graham Mertz play quarterback and went, now that's a good quarterback. Not a single time. And it's a weird situation with Florida's quarterback room. You lose Anthony Richardson to the NFL. The assumed backup got himself in some legal trouble related to child pornography, I believe, that they found on his computer. So he's off the team. The next guy in line would have been Jack Miller, who we affectionately refer to around here as Jack Leg. After watching the bowl game and the spring game, it became clear that he's just not a good quarterback. He's, for whatever reason, he looks lost out there. So everyone knew, or at least had a pretty good assumption, that Florida was going to go out into the transfer portal market and bring someone in. And there were a lot of big-name QBs that hit the transfer portal this offseason. I'm not going to go through the list, but if you pay any attention at all to college football during the offseason, you know who these names are. Graham Mertz was not on any of those lists. And Billy Napier goes out. He gets Graham Mertz, the quarterback from Wisconsin. The quarterback from Wisconsin who caused a man to lose his job. The head coach there was fired after last year because their offense has just been absolutely abysmal with 2 years of Graham Mertz. I mean, the guy, he's not very good. And if there's anybody that doesn't know that, you're going to find out that this season when you watch Florida play with Graham Mertz at QB. But that was the best Billy Napier and Florida were able to do for this season. Now, they've got some QB commits and some younger QBs, most notably Lagway that comes in next year. But how much help is that even going to be, really, as a true freshman? Not even this season. Now we're skipping ahead to 24. Lagway might be your best option in 24, but he's going to be a true freshman. So it's not a good situation overall for Florida at the quarterback situation, either immediately or in the near future. Now, if Lagway ends up being really, really good, then obviously that solves Florida's quarterback problems for a couple of years, probably in 25 and 26. But 23 and 24 are looking pretty bad for Florida at the quarterback position. Like I said, Graham Mertz has 32 starts for Wisconsin, and none of them were good. When you think of Wisconsin, what do you think about? Running the ball, and that's it. No passing game. And, people like Graham Mertz are a reason why. The offensive line was a strong suit for Florida last year, but you lose 4 of your 5 starters along that offensive line, including All-American and the best offensive lineman maybe that you've had in a while. That guard, Osiris, is off to the NFL. So you got 4 offensive linemen you got to replace from what was, I think, the best unit on your team last year, that offensive line. Not a lot of pre-existing talent on the roster for Florida at that position. So, again, they go out, they raid the transfer portal, bringing in several transfers along the offensive line, 3 of which I think could have significant playing time, possibly even start. They brought in a kid from Baylor, a kid from Kentucky, and a kid from Bama. 2 or all 3 of those, I believe, are going to start. You also have a tackle from last year that's back that I think has a lot of potential too. So it's kind of a we'll see type of thing for Florida's offensive line. They're trying to cobble an offensive line together with different pieces from the transfer portal. I don't see a scenario where Florida's offensive line is as good as it was last year. It looks like it could be bad. It looks like it could go from a strong point to a weak point. But if the majority of these transfers pan out and end up being good players, it's possible Florida has an okay offensive line, although I don't think it'll be on the level that it was last year. Let's talk about those 2 running backs I mentioned a minute ago, Montel Johnson and Trevor Etienne. They're both back, had over 1,500 yards last year rushing combined between the 2 of them with 16 touchdowns. These are 2 good running backs. This is a good 1-2 combination of running backs, I think, for Florida in the SEC. Maybe not the best running back room in the SEC. In fact, it's definitely not the best running back room in the SEC, but far from the worst. These are more than capable SEC running backs. Again, my concern about Florida's ground game this year doesn't have anything to do with the running backs. I think the running backs are fine, but replacing 4 starters on the offensive line and losing Anthony Richardson's ability to run the ball, I think both will negatively impact Florida overall in terms of team rushing. Wide receiver is another area where Florida's going to have to find some help somewhere. Ricky Pearsall's back, and he's a good player. He's a guy that transferred in a couple of off seasons ago from out in Arizona and had a pretty good year last year, especially he had a really good end to the season. But Xavier Henderson, who's kind of the veteran, has been there a long time. Not the most elite wide receiver in the country by any means, but a really good player, a reliable, somebody that you can count on. He's transferred out to, I believe, Cincinnati. So really at the wide receiver position, Ricky Pearsall's all you have coming back that did anything at all last year. Florida's going to have to find some answers and some options on the outside at wide receiver to try to help Graham Mertz in 2023. All right, on to the defensive side of the ball for the Florida Gators. And Florida's defense was just an absolute joke last season. Like I said, there's no sugarcoating it. It was really, really bad. I'll give you some stats on that here in just a few minutes. And while I do think that Florida's defense will be better in 2023 than it was in 2022, I'm not sure how much better it will be overall. I like their secondary. I think that's going to be the strength of the defense, but they got a lot of question marks along the defensive line and a lot of question marks at linebacker. Florida last year defensively it gave up 50% conversion rate on third down. Now, I don't know how closely some of you follow third down conversion rates or whatever, but over the course of a season, as a defense, to allow a 50% conversion rate on third downs is absolutely horrendous. I was dead last in the SEC. Nobody was worse on third down last year in the SEC than Florida. And that's the money down. Those are the downs you just have to win. Those end drives, those keep points off the board. Those force teams to kick field goals as opposed to going on to score touchdowns. I mean, there's just a list of reasons a mile long why third down is so important. And no one was worse at it last year than Florida. That's an obvious stat that Florida's got to get a lot better at in 2023 for that defense to take a step forward. And like I said, there's going to be a lot of new pieces. There's going to be a lot of new parts, and more importantly, a new defensive coordinator with a new system and a new philosophy. So I do expect Florida's defense to take a step forward. Overall, the question, like I said, is going to be how much of a step forward and how much will it matter, really, in terms of wins or losses, which we're going to talk about in just a second when we throw the schedule up on the screen. Florida gave up 30 points or more in 6 of their 7 losses. 30 points or more. Again, you are just not going to win very many college football games giving up 30 points a game. You're not. You're just not going to do it. That is just really, really bad. Your top defenses in college football are giving up between 10 and 15 points a game. Florida's giving up twice that many. It's just not a recipe for success. Maybe back in the Steve Spurrier days when Florida had that high-flying offense, you could afford to give up 25 or 30 points a handful of times over the course of a season. Those days are long gone for the Florida man. Florida's offense is horrendous. I can tell you this right now, and we'll put, like I said, we'll put the schedule up in a minute, but when I put this schedule up, if I tell you that anybody on that schedule is going to score 30 points, you're going to say, well, then Florida's losing that game. Like, it's going to be hard for Florida's offense to score points this year. So if the defense is going to continue to give up 30 points or gives up 30 points in half their games, then they're going to lose at least half their games. They have got to shave at least a touchdown off of that. You just can't be giving up 30 points a game. It's absolutely horrendous. All right, Austin Armstrong, new defensive coordinator they brought in from, like I said, believe Alabama. A young coach. Brings a lot of energy, excitability to the Florida defense. 29 years old. 29 years old. So given a big opportunity here at a young age, we'll see how he handles it, the new defensive coordinator at Florida. All right, let's take a look at the defensive personnel. Now, along the defensive line, Memphis transfer, Cam Jackson, 6'6", 355. And now, look, do y'all remember that Florida player? I believe he was nose tackle, but I don't know his name. The guy looked like a building. Outside of him, Florida's been kind of undersized along the defensive line. So they've made a concerted effort to go out and get bigger along the defensive line. That starts here with this Memphis transfer, Cam Jackson, 6'6", 355. So a big body there on the interior coming up this season for the Florida Gators. Now, we'll see how well he is, how good he does, how he performs, that kind of thing. But in terms of just the size of player that Florida is looking for along the defensive line, this is a pretty good indication here. Now, in addition to Cam Jackson, who you brought in from Memphis, 6 other newcomers on the defensive line, a total of 7 first-year players on Florida's defensive line in 2023. Now, this is, of course, going to be a combination of incoming freshmen and transfers, but you're basically going to see an entirely new defensive front for Florida this year, at least in terms of personnel, for the most part. 7 new players along that defensive line. Freshman Kelby Collins, he's probably going to play. I think he was a top 50 player in the nation, one of their highest rated recruits from this last year's signing class. I wouldn't be surprised at all to see him get a lot of playing time. Like I said, they need talent along that defensive line, even if it's young talent. I'm I'm worried about Florida's defensive line from a depth perspective, talent perspective, experience perspective, whatever you want to call it. Like I said, 7 new players, probably going to have to play a true freshman. Your star player might be someone you brought in from Memphis. I got a lot of questions about Florida's defensive line heading into 2023. You do bring back that edge rusher with a weird name, Princely, Umama Maiden, or whatever the hell his name is. Again, I don't name these people. It's not my job to name them. It's just my job to mispronounce their name, and I'm doing a really good job on that. But you bring him back. He had 9.5 tackles for loss last year. So a potential bright spot here defensively for Florida with him coming back. Sophomore Shamar James, 47 tackles. He's your leading returning tackler. He's a linebacker. But again, I've got a lot of questions about Florida when it comes to the front 7. Now, I think their secondary could be pretty good. Definitely the strength of that defense, I think, is going to be the secondary. But that front 7 for Florida is going to be very, very shaky. And again, not very deep at all. Injuries are never good, but injuries affect certain teams more than others. Florida's got to avoid injuries along the front 7 of the defense because they just don't have the quality depth behind it that some of the better teams in the SEC have accumulated over the last several recruiting and transfer cycles. But back to the secondary, though, safety. Now, here's another bright spot on Florida. These 2 players, that edge rusher, Princely, whatever his name is, Kamari Wilson. He was a freshman last year. Another kid that was everybody wanted him out of high school, very highly rated recruit. Signs with Florida, played last year as a freshman, Kamari Wilson. He could have a breakout year this year at safety. So I'm not worried about him. I think he'll be fine. Third-year guy at corner, James Marshall, I think his name is. He played pretty well last year at times too. He's back. And then the recruiting class was absolutely loaded with defensive backs. 6 freshman defensive backs in last year's recruiting class for Florida. Now, how many of those will play? Several of them probably. How many will start? Well, that I'm not so sure. It's hard to start as a true freshman in the secondary of the SEC. You see it from time to time, but generally you don't see it that often. But this is a situation where Florida can rotate these guys in and out, get them some experience as they become more comfortable with the scheme and the system, that kind of thing. Some talented guys they brought in last year's recruiting class in that secondary. So just to recap on the defense here, Princely coming back, pretty good edge rusher. You got one linebacker that could be okay to Shamar James, whatever his name is. But generally speaking, I'm worried about Florida's front 7. I think the secondary, the best part of that defense. All right, let's put Florida's schedule up on the screen for 2023. We're going to go through it game by game, and I'm going to give you a winner and a loser for every single week. All right, another tough task for Florida in 2023. Just not a lot of guaranteed W's on here. And if you think this is bad, you should fast forward and look at the 2024 schedule. Florida's in for a rough period. That's all there is to it. I don't know that it matters how good or bad of a coach Billy Napier is or ends up being. They've already had back-to-back losing seasons. They're projected to have a losing season this year. We already talked about that. The Vegas win total for Florida is at 5.5. And then if you fast forward to next year and you look at Florida's 2024 schedule, knowing what you know about Florida and what sort of pieces they might have for next year, Florida might be a better team in 24 than they are in 23, but they're probably going to have a worse record in 24 than they have in 23. So whatever you think Florida's going to do this year, you can probably take a game or 2 off for next year. It's just going to end up being a rough period for Florida. But let's try to go through this schedule here and pick out the wins and losses. Just like last year, you start out with Utah. This year on the road out in Salt Lake City. So a long way to go for Florida. And sort of famously, Florida has not played a road non-conference Power 5 opponent outside of the state of Florida since 1991. Now, I know that's a lot to kind of digest there, but Florida has not played a Power 5 opponent on the road outside of their own state since 1991. They play Florida State almost every year, right? That's a non-con Power 5 opponent. But even when they play Florida State on the road, that's still in Florida. They haven't played a road game outside of that since 1991, and that was on the road at Syracuse, and they lost. So a monumental occasion here for the Florida Gators, playing a Power 5 opponent outside of their own state in a road game environment. A lot of Florida fans like to bitch and moan every time I say that and name a bunch of bowl games and neutral site games that they played in. I'm going to tell you a secret. There's 3 types of games in football: home games, away games, neutral site games. Neutral site games are not road games, dummy. This is the first road game Florida has played against a non-conference Power 5 opponent since 1991 when they lost to Syracuse on the road at Utah. Everybody's got Utah in their top 15. A lot of people have them in their top 10. This was a great game last year and probably Billy Napier's best win. This would be huge for Florida if they could go on the road and start things out 1-0. I'll be the first to admit, if Florida wins this game, immediately I'll have to recalculate my expectations for Florida in 2023. I'll be the first one to admit I was wrong about Florida and to recalculate the expectations. With that being said, I'm picking Utah to win and Florida to lose this one. It was a great game last year. Unlike Florida, Utah does have their quarterback returning, Cameron Rising. They got a lot of their defense back. They're a tough, hard-nosed football team. They're one of the most well-coached football teams in the country. Unfamiliar road environment. It's a Thursday night game. This place is going to be rocking out there in Utah. There are some questions about Cam Rising and whether or not he will be able to start this game, or if he does start, how close to 100% he will be. He tore his knee at the very end of last season. Had the surgery, been going through the rehab. He skipped all of spring. Now, I don't think skipping spring in and of itself is that bad for somebody like Cameron Rising. He's a veteran quarterback. He's been there 4 years. He's not a young kid that kind of needs to go through spring practice to get, more reps or something like that. Now, it could hurt the team from a chemistry perspective, timing on the pass routes, things like that with the new wide receivers. Obviously, Utah is going to need Cameron Rising back in this game. I'm operating off the assumption that he will be back. Most Utah people seem to think that he will be back. We'll see. But I'm taking Utah to win this one. Florida starts off the season 0-1. You come back home, you play McNeese. It should be a pretty easy win, even for Florida. I don't see any way Florida loses this game, even if they get embarrassed on the road at Utah and kind of tuck their tail type of deal. This would be, God, by the way, if Florida loses to Utah, that would be back-to-back losses to Pac-12 teams. That might be enough to get Florida kicked out of the SEC, honestly. You're already Florida's on a 3-game losing streak right now, right? Yeah, you're on a 3-game losing streak. You're on a 3-game losing streak right now. You lost to Florida State at the end of the year. Who'd you lose to before that? Was it Vandy? Florida's lost to Vandy, Florida State, and Oregon State in their last 3 games. Is that true? Jesus, that's absolutely horrible. Florida's on a 3-game losing streak. If they lose to Utah, it'll be a 4-game losing streak with 2 losses in a row to the Pac-12. Unbelievable. Thank God you're playing McNeese State the week after that. You'll get a win there. You're 1-1. And then you host Tennessee. Yes, Florida has absolutely owned and dominated Tennessee over the last 15 to 20 years. There's no question about it. No doubt about it. Probably should have beat Florida worse last year at home than they did too. I've been saying this all offseason, so if you're somebody who listens to me during the offseason on a lot of the live shows or whatever, I've said this, I have not changed my mind. I am not a Tennessee fan. I have spent a lot of time on this channel bashing Tennessee. Tennessee is going to beat Florida by 40. I don't think this game is going to be competitive or close in the least. I think Tennessee looks to make a statement early in the year here. They play Virginia early in the season, which is just a nothing burger. No one's even going to be paying attention to that game. Then they play a nobody, and then they have this game. So this is Tennessee's first kind of big game of the year. You will already have played Utah, which on one hand could be an advantage. You got some experience in a big environment already in that season. I just think Tennessee comes in and absolutely blows Florida away on their home field in Gainesville, Ben Hill Griffin Trailer Swamp or whatever it's called. I seriously think Tennessee just absolutely destroys Florida. I know the game was close last year, definitely a lot closer than people thought it would be. Tennessee last year was an important year for Tennessee. We all know how the season ended. They ended up 10-2, 11-2 after a New Year's 6 win over Clemson and all that. But Tennessee had to go through kind of a mental progression over the course of the year. Tennessee's been bad for a really long time. I'm not even telling Tennessee fans anything they don't know. Tennessee's football team was just so used to losing. I don't think Tennessee's football team really had the confidence it needed, probably until that Alabama game, which was 4 or 5 weeks later in the season, halfway through October when they beat Alabama. Tennessee became a much more confident team. They started to believe in themselves. Tennessee used to show up for these games against Florida, Georgia, Bama, pretty much anybody that was ranked, not expecting to win. They just didn't expect to win. And they played Florida early in the season last year. They had struggled on the road a couple of weeks before that against Pitt. They had to beat Pitt in overtime. Florida had an onside kick at the end of the game against Tennessee last year, where if they would have got the ball back, they would have had a chance to tie it or win it. It kind of looked like the same Tennessee team we had seen for a long time, but instead of losing those heartbreaking close games, they won them. They beat Pitt. They beat Florida. And you could kind of see Tennessee's confidence growing over the course of the season. Then the Alabama game happened and floodgates opened and the rest is history. But I don't think Tennessee has that problem anymore, not with Florida. You see this a lot of times when you've lost to a team so many times in a row, or two out of the, Tennessee had lost to Florida like 14 of the last 16 years. It becomes a mental hurdle that a team has to get over. I don't think Tennessee has that problem this year. I think they roll into Gainesville and absolutely destroy Florida. I mean, one of the worst beatings in the history of this series. I think Florida's sitting at 1-2. Back home again the following week where you play the Charlotte 49ers. Again, a win for Florida, no problem. Is Billy Napier ever going to beat another Power 5 team, though? At this point, you will have lost Tennessee, Utah, Oregon State, Florida State, and I believe it was Vandy the week before that. You will have lost to the last 5 Power 5 teams you played. You will have lost to the last 5 Power 5 teams you've played at this point, even with the wins over McNeese and Charlotte. And then you go on the road at Kentucky. This used to be a game you could just pencil in for Florida every single year. Didn't Florida beat them 35 years in a row, 32 years in a row, something like that? It was 30-something years in a row Florida beat Kentucky. That streak was snapped several years ago, and since then, Kentucky's got a winning record over Florida the last 4, 5, 6 seasons, whatever it is. Great game last year. Kentucky won it on the road in Gainesville. This year, Kentucky gets them at home. This is not going to be an easy game for either team. Kentucky, just like Florida, lost their quarterback. Unlike Florida, Kentucky brought in a quarterback who's actually been good in college. Kentucky brings in Devin Leary, the quarterback from NC State. And no, NC State was not some amazing team the last couple of years with Devin Leary. But Devin Leary's been a much better quarterback over the last couple of years than Graham Mertz. Kentucky's got some questions of its own. Now, they'll tell you that they've got their best wide receiver room they've had in a while. I'm not saying I don't believe them, but I've got to see Kentucky spread the ball out and sling it around to elite wide receivers before I'm willing to believe it. There are certain things about Kentucky I don't question. Their toughness, their coaching. They're going to get the most out of the players they have with that coaching staff there. They're going to have good lines of scrimmage. This is going to be one of the most physical games Florida plays all year long. Kirby Smart says the same thing every year after Georgia plays Kentucky. He says that's the most physical opponent they play every year. So you're going to get beat up along the lines of scrimmage. I don't mean beat up like pushed around and dominated. I just mean it's going to be a physical game on the road at Kentucky. I think you lose. I think Kentucky beats you again. I think Florida now losing record 5 weeks into the season. You're sitting at 2-3, and your only 2 wins are against McNeese and Charlotte. All right, the good news is after you lose to Kentucky, you get to come back home and play Vandy. And yeah, I know Vandy beat you last year, and yeah, that's embarrassing. And yeah, myself and everyone else with an internet connection has been laughing at you about it for the last 8 months, 9 months, whatever it's been. With that being said, I don't think Florida's losing 2 years in a row to Vandy. The losing streak comes to an end. Sunbelt Billy and the Florida Gators finally get a win over a Power 5 team after losing 6 games in a row to Power 5 opponents dating back to last season. You finally get off to Schneid. You finally beat a Power 5 team. And even though that Power 5 team is Vandy, this is reason to celebrate if you're a Florida man. You get you a win there. You're now sitting at 3-3 on the season. 3-3, amazing. Keeping your head above water. Then you go on the road to South Carolina, a team you absolutely destroyed last year, 38-6, and one of the weirdest outcomes that we saw all of last year. I've already done a South Carolina version of this video. If you've seen it, I've got good news and I've got bad news, depending on whether or not you're a Florida or a South Carolina fan. I think Florida loses again. I did the South Carolina video already. I picked South Carolina to win. I'm not going to change my mind now just because I'm previewing a different team. I think Florida loses on the road in Williams-Brice Stadium, one of the toughest places to play. I think South Carolina's got an obvious quarterback advantage in this game. I'm not Spencer Rattler's biggest fan. I've said it a bunch of times. He's got to be way more consistent. Yeah, he played great at the end of the year against Tennessee and Clemson. He was absolutely horrendous for the 10 games before that. He had the worst quarterback rating in the SEC all the way up until like week 11. He's got to be way more consistent. Now, it's his third year in college, his second year in Columbia, but they've got a brand new offensive coordinator again. So this is his third offensive coordinator in 3 years, Spencer Rattler, and they lost some important pieces around it. They got some coming back. I'm not convinced South Carolina is going to be some kind of a great team, but I am convinced Florida is not going to be some kind of a great team. And this is a tough road environment here. A tough road environment. I think you lose on the road to South Carolina. Much needed bye week for the Florida man after a brutal start to the season has you sitting at 3-4 heading into your biggest game of the year every single year, the cocktail party against the Georgia Bulldogs. Georgia Bulldogs, of course, coming off back-to-back national titles, an undefeated perfect season last year, 15-0, something Florida's never done. And I'm not just talking about 15-0. I'm talking about a perfect season. Not one time in Florida's history have they ever won every single game in a season. I think they have 1 year where they didn't have any losses, but they had a tie. Yes, college football used to have ties. Overtime wasn't always a thing. Florida, 0 perfect seasons over the course of its history. Florida comes off a bye week. They host Georgia, back-to-back national champions, won the SEC last year, then beat Ohio State and TCU in the playoffs to win their second straight national championships. They're 29-1 in the last 2 seasons, winning 2 national titles in a row, winning the SEC last season. Georgia's 14th SEC championship, by the way. Florida's got 8. Interesting side note about the Florida Gators. They've been in the SEC since the 1930s, the Florida Gators have. And Florida fans love to talk about how great they were in the 90s and 2000s. And listen, that's true. In the 90s, they won 1 national title and several SEC titles. In the 2000s, they won 2 national titles and several SEC titles. That's 2 decades where Florida was really, really good. But guess what happened in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 2010s, and 2020s? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Florida won 0 SEC titles in the rest of those decades. So Florida's been playing football in the SEC for 10 decades. In 8 of those 10 decades, they've been absolute garbage, not even winning the SEC a single time in 8 of those 10 decades. But yes, they were good in the 90s and the 2000s. So everybody that looks at Florida right now and wonders how they got this bad, you're asking the wrong question. You should have been looking at Florida in the 90s and 2000s and asking, how did they get this good? What you're seeing now is not the exception to the rule. It is the rule. Florida's a terrible program. They have been for 8 of the last 10 decades. Horrendous. Horrendous. It's not surprising that Florida's bad right now. What's surprising is that they were good in the 90s and 2000s. Anyway, Georgia will beat you by 40 like they normally do. You're 3-5 or something. Just absolutely horrendous. And then Arkansas, again, a physical, tough team. I mean, you've got some Kentucky, Georgia, Arkansas. These are teams that, love to play line of scrimmage football and beat you up along the lines of scrimmage. I've got too many questions about Arkansas, though. I do think you beat Arkansas. Not a gimme. KJ Jefferson is back. He's like dollar store Cam Newton. In other words, he looks like Cam Newton. He just doesn't have near the talent or ability. And I'm just not convinced that Arkansas has nearly enough pieces around him. Defensively, they seem to take a step back last year. And unfortunately, because I like Sam Pittman, it looks like Arkansas might have peaked a couple of seasons ago under him. I think Florida gets to win at home over Arkansas, although I do think it'll be a tough game. On the road at LSU, you can't beat LSU if your life depends on it. And that's when you're good and LSU is bad. Right now, it's the opposite. Florida's an absolute dumpster fire, and LSU is pretty good. They won the West last year in Brian Kelly's first year. They're in the top 10 of every preseason ranking you can find. They're in the top 5 of a lot of preseason rankings. You have to play them there. They're going to absolutely destroy you. You lose again. On the road at Mizzou, I'm going to give you a win here. But look, I'm giving you a win against Arkansas and Missouri. It's possible you split there. It's possible you go 1-1 against them. But I'm gonna give you a win. I think you beat Arkansas, lose to LSU. I'm gonna give you a win on the road at Mizzou. Mizzou's been 500 every single year Drinkwitz has been there. 6-6. The COVID year was a little weird. I think they were 4-6 or 6-5, something like that, with a bowl game or something. But they've been basically 500 every single year. We'll see what they do this year. They got some quarterback questions too. They brought Garcia in from Miami, so we'll see what that means. But I'm going to give you a win here on the road at Missouri. And then you come back home, play in-state rival Florida State. And look, unfortunately for you, Florida State's found a way to dig themselves out of the gutter. You haven't. You're still scrounging around down there looking for loose change. Florida State's found its way into the top 10 here in the offseason and is looking to put together a run for an ACC title and a potential trip to the playoffs for next year. You're not beating them to cap the season off. It's just not going to happen. They're miles ahead of you right now in both coaching and talent. You lose to Florida State. The Florida Gators end the 2023 season 5-7. They miss a bowl game, and that makes not one, not two, but 3 losing seasons in a row for the Florida Gators and back-to-back losing seasons for Sunbelt Billy, our buddy Billy Napier, the Cajun Willie Taggart. Turns out Uncle Lou might have been right. Sunbelt Billy is in over his head and doesn't know what he's doing. Have a good morning.